The point of the tariff policy is that it was to reset the world order, and that's why they installed Trump. America knows they lost the trade war. Tariffs was a recognition that China had already won. Who does Trump work for? The financial industrial complex. Capitalism and communism are fake ideologies. America is a socialist country, but socialist for the rich. It is a socialist corptocracy, and that's the lie. China basically said, we'll build capitalism, but they said, Elon Musk, Jamie Dimon, Larry Fink, you will never become more powerful than the government. Now they've got so much reserves, they've built this Belt and Road Initiative, and so everybody's taking Chinese money over IMF right now. BlackRock is not America first. They care about using the dollar for as long as possible, and they got socialism because they control the politicians. Fiscal dominance, printing money, tariffs, it was a tax on the American people, then a tax on the American consumer. It's a lie. Everything's a lie.
Archie.
You mentioned China organizing an alternative world order. I mean, the West would constantly compare itself or contrast itself with previously the Soviet Union, but of the last 30 years versus, against China. And the comparison was always, we've got capitalism, which drives efficiency, effectiveness, and we've got all these freedoms. And look at them over there. They've got communism. They can't make anything they copy, and they can only make things that are low value, high volume production. But it seems of late that we are edging more towards the authoritarian caricature that we put upon a nation like China, and don't do capitalism particularly well, and can't seem to build infrastructure on time, on budget. Whereas China is doing capitalism exceedingly well, and even outdoing the West when it comes to technical, scientific innovation. How do you see that?
America is nothing that, America is a PR. It is public relations. So we have a phrase in the anti-war Israel movement of every accusation is a confession, because everything they accuse you of is their confession. Like, they're doing everything that they're accusing. They're the ones doing the sexual violence. They're the ones doing the prisoners. They're the ones doing the terrorism. And there is a resistance movement against that. And there's all sorts of covert operations we could go through. The same is with America. In order to stop you focusing on this proof of weapons network, they told you it's the radical left, it's the communists, it's the LGBTQs, it's whatever ideology, it's the terrorists, it's the Islamists. Like, they'll come up with a new ist every time in order to say we need to go to war with them. But what they were preventing was competition. They wanted global hegemon. And the only resistance against that was the Soviet Union that they were benefiting from as well in the Wall Street coffers. And then eventually that fell, and then you had the global hegemon, and oil was priced in dollars as a result of that. So now you had this one force. And this one force cannibalized itself, because capitalism is code word. And again, I'm not anti-capitalist. I'm not any of these things. Capitalism and communism are fake ideologies. They're not real. There is no capitalist country in the world today. Like, you had it in the Islamic golden era where you had free trade, hard money, but you had layers of ethics on top of that. They took the layers of ethics and they took out the hard money and created a debt-based Ponzi scheme. And then Adam Smith created a book called The Wealth of Nations and said it was his work, when it was really the Islamic scholarly work that happened during the golden age of Islam. As with everything that was just, the books were destroyed, they put a new label on it and said, we created all this stuff. And so, you had this fake capitalism, which was a debt-based Ponzi scheme to extract wealth and take everyone to a totalitarian state. Inevitable, predictable, and guaranteed. If you create a system where the currency is debt and there's not enough money to pay the debt, then the only way to substitute it is through government debt. And then you get this elaborate scheme in order to make sure everyone's lending to the US. Now, with that massive capital inflows, you get to create a lot of stuff. And you can use your war in order to use their resources. So everything was built off the blood of everyone else's resources with their money in their poverty that came back to America, and they call it capitalism. All of these wars were about stopping competition. And capitalism requires competition. If you want an invisible hand, you need competition, because monopolies are not part of even Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations or even any classical economics. And then they went into Keynesianism anyway. Even Keynesianism they didn't do. That's another lie. Keynesianism says the government needs to subsidize to reach full employment in times of bad economies. And then you need to pay down the debt on the upside. They forgot the second half.
That's the part they forgot.
And they can't, because the dollar is debt. So if you pay down the debt, you get the Great Depression. So even Elon Musk pretending I'm going to create the Department of Government Efficiency in order to pay down the debt, what you're saying is we're going to crash the world. Because when the debt stops rolling over, the economy, the whole dominoes, there is no chair on the musical chairs. The debt has to increase forever. And Department of Government Efficiency was just a data exercise anyway. Going too far. That's the American economy. Now China said, okay, we're going to do a 100-year strategy, because we don't need to get elections every 2 years and start having left and right divides that distracts people from the reality that there is a corporate class that never changes. And this whole thing called democracy was actually a technocracy or a corporatocracy, whatever you want to call it, because they ruled all the way and they had consistent, just like China. But what they were able to do is rape the country of their manufacturing base by focusing the whole economy on financialization to roll over the Ponzi. Until eventually they owned everything. So they took every industry and made sure that you were paying the tax. In 1913, you got the introduction of income tax. There was no income tax before that. So they needed to use the income tax to pay the debt. Tax goes up. Inflation goes up. Those that own the assets end up beating inflation. Wages don't go up at the same rate. Massive wealth extraction.
That wasn't always the case, though. Like, I remember a time, at least 80s and up until about the early 90s in Australia, where we did have stronger worker representation in areas where individual workers did not have much bargaining power. And their wages kept up. Inflation was a collective problem then for government policymakers, because they couldn't simply put the burden onto people who were workers. They had to actually solve the structural issues underpinning inflation. But as that's become weakened, worker representation through unions has become weaker and weaker over decades. Same within America to a much larger extent. Workers weren't able to claw back through collective bargaining what they lost through inflation.
Yeah, and what do? You demonize it and say, hey, that's socialism and communism. That's what you do. You create it, that's the radical left. That's the Democrats, that's the Labours, that's the anti-capitalist movement. While at the same time, you're not following capitalism at the top of the power structure. You're following an elaborate debt-based Ponzi scheme that buys the politicians. And
it was only when I came to the UK that I found out that large corporations do wage price set by comparing. And the way they get away with it is saying, well, we're in the oil and gas industry, so an accountant in the oil and gas industry is not really vying for a job to be an accountant in the media industry, for example. And we know that's absolute nonsense, because skills are transferable and happens all the time. But what they then do is they say, okay, well, you're a telecoms and we're an oil and gas company, and you're a football club or a transport company. Let's compare how much we're paying based on years of experience and qualifications. And then what you're effectively doing then is you're signaling, because you can't do that in the market. You can't signal what you're willing to pay and what you're going to pay. And then that sets a standard that neither company will go above beyond a certain amount. So when you're in the market then looking for an accountant, you know how to set your prices based on all the other companies you've benchmarked against. And now what happens is there's another subset of there's another group also from various industries. So you might have 10 of these groups, all with the same sort of industry cohort made up, and they're all comparing with one another. Essentially what you're doing is you're price setting across industries for a particular skill set. And this happens for every single skill set across all industries. But then when you have a look at workers who want to go into the marketplace and bargain collectively, we call that socialism. And so how is it that one group is allowed to have this unfair advantage, but the other group is not able to level the playing field?
You've nailed it. You have America is a socialist country, but socialist for the rich. They get all the socialism. They get the bailout from the bank. They get price fixing. They get government Pentagon budgets. They get big, beautiful bills. They get the ability to borrow through quantitative easing in order to push up the price of their stocks. And they get to, basically, it is a socialist corptocracy in order to inflict their technology. And that's the lie. That's the lie. America is a socialism for the rich. Now you take a country like, let's give you an example. Saudi Arabia says, we managed to keep our oil, even though we had to give 50% to America. Once we were powerful enough, we managed to renegotiate that, and we didn't take it public. And what is Saudi and all these sovereign wealth funds? They're basically taking public companies and privatizing them so they can control them. And what they're doing is they're decolonizing by buying their freedom, because all of these assets were financialized, tokenized, and securitized, and now anyone can buy them. China can buy them. And that's how you end up in a scenario, by the way, where BlackRock is not America first, because they care about the American stock market. They care about capital markets. They care about using the dollar for as long as possible. They don't care about the people at all. And if there's more profits to be made there, then these are, quote unquote globalists. These are global institutions that have no allegiance to country. And those are the JP Morgan, and they got socialism, because they control the politicians. And so you have got the very epitome. So what did China do? Well, China said, we went through a century of humiliation. We went through opium wars. We went through pillage. We went through rape. We went through a century of humiliation. And they said, we're going to create a century plan. And so through currencies, they essentially built their manufacturing base with their cheap labor. They used communism and central planning when they needed to. And they switched to capitalism, but they did a few things. And this is why capitalism and communism and socialism and all the isms are such a lie. There is a country, it has resources, and there are ways of optimizing those resources. You have a way of creating currency, and you can either create it for the people or create it for the private banks or create it as debt or create it debt-free. And you need a mechanism for having your currency. You have resources. You can either tax people, or you can say, we'll keep the oil, and because we build our wealth through our oil, you don't need to pay any taxes. And so Saudis don't pay taxes. They have some taxes, but they don't pay taxes. They keep all their money. Imagine how much better if, obviously Saudi is not capitalist because it is dealing, it is buying capitalism essentially through all these sovereign wealths and now acquiring assets to diversify their economy. But imagine how much better a capitalism could function if you weren't taxed, if you just got to keep your money. You'd invest your money in your business and your freedom, and you do a whole load of stuff. So capitalism, I think, functions a lot better if you take the resources under the ground and say, this is an alternative to tax. But we're told that's a no-go, that's socialism, that's communism, you can't do that. You have to tokenize it, securitize it, and financialize it, give it to, the private. And what did America do? Essentially, America used a religious war of settler colonialism and genocide to take over the land, expel all the natives from the land so that they could take over the oil, and then the Rockefeller family had it, and then they used that to build the Federal Reserve with the partners of the European banks. But we're told that's capitalism. It's a lie. Everything's a lie. And where did you perpetuate these ideologies and these economic thought? Well, there was Islamic thought with the golden age of Islam. Then we had the funding of all these universities from the wealthy class. And those are now the largest endowment funds in the world. And so if you want to teach a doctor to be a doctor and instead you turn them into a drug dealer, then you control the syllabus. If you want to turn an economic social science into debt dealers, then you train these economists to work for the banks and the Fed. And the education system is a vital part of training minions to serve corporate interest as well. So even the education system and the political system and the socialization of bailout and government budgets, there's no, you're telling me that's an invisible hand? There is no capitalism in that at all. So China basically said, right, we'll do that. We'll build capitalism, but we won't allow a company to ever get bigger than the government. And we won't allow for the free flow of capital. Now, to us as a freedom and a Bitcoiner, that sounds like a nightmare, right? Authoritarian nightmare, no freedom of speech. I can't just take my Chinese yuan and convert it to Bitcoin easily. A nightmare, like in terms of the freedom that we value. But if you think about it from a Chinese perspective, they didn't want JP Morgan to take over their economy. And they said, Elon Musk, you will never become more powerful than the government. Jamie Dimon, you will never become more powerful than government. Larry Fink, you will never become more powerful than the government. And we want to protect our currency so that we can't be exploited by Western colonizers. The Chinese built the Great Wall of China to compete the barbarians out, not to colonize the world. They were the victims of opium wars. They were the people, they've had their colonial expeditions in the past. All empires go this route. But they essentially said, we want currency control so that they can't take over our currency and destroy us. We want to control capital flows. We want where the government is, the CCP is the ruling party. No corporation is bigger than us. And in exchange for that, 99% of Chinese people own their property. Almost all of them have got savings. They've got a bit of a consumption issue right now because people are savings. But
they've always seemed to have that, but it doesn't seem to impede their growth at all. So why is it a problem? Who says it's a problem?
Exactly. And now they've got so much reserves that they've built this Belt and Road Initiative that said, right, we've built the world's largest manufacturing base. We don't want to prevent competition. We want you to buy our stuff. So we're going to invest in your infrastructure because we want your country to be wealthy. Yeah, we may do a bit of a predatory deal, but this is nothing like the IMF. The IMF comes with austerity. It comes with predatory conditions. It comes with install a Western central bank that becomes a shareholder in the Bank for International Settlements. It comes with take this loan and you will give it back to us and you'll spend it on our products. And basically we're just printing some dollars and then giving it back to the companies that's going to be getting these contracts from you. And if you don't do everything we say, we're going to tell you have to install a liberal democracy. And we want to use your currency to devalue your savings and steal all your assets. And you're our bitch. That's what an IMF loan is.
It's like a loan from Tony Soprano, who sets the conditions so that you do default in order to be able to take over the assets that you have, your family home, and take it all over. And they set you up for failure, essentially.
Exactly. Now, China said, well, we want you to be rich so you can buy our stuff. And we're not going to tell you how to govern. We've got our own way of governing. You probably don't like our way of doing things. We don't like your way of doing things, but I don't care. We just want to make you wealthy so you can buy our stuff. And now they go into those countries in Africa and say, why don't you, we're taking some of your rare earth minerals and we're building these components, but why don't we invest in your infrastructure so you can have your own factory? And now you can actually build the next layer of the product up. And now you can actually maintain your wealth. And if you become wealthier, we can partner. And so everybody's taking Chinese money over IMF now.
China's rise has been achieved without, have they started any wars in the last 40 years?
No, they have said we would take the territories that we believe are ours, which was Macau, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. But we definitely don't want to go to war. We just have a one China policy because those were our territories. Hong Kong was created when HSBC funded the Opium Wars, which was a drug dealing cartel to steal China's silver using India's resources and steal their gold. And you can do the same story with Macau and the Japanese wars and how that relates to Pearl Harbor and the embargo to steal all the oil that led to the creation of Taiwan. And they just said we want our territory. But we don't actually want to do it. They were, from my perspective, there's zero interest in reunifying with Taiwan. That's a Western story to justify militarizing Philippines, Taiwan, Japan, and the various island disputes there. Create a narrative of fear. If China ever reunified with Taiwan to get those silicon chips, and those chips are essential.
But they don't need them anymore. They're making their own.
They're making their own. No one can make them like Taiwan yet.
They're not far from that.
I agree they will get there. And now America's saying we need to be more like China. So Trump then says, okay, Biden said we'll put a $50 billion CHIPS Act to get TSMC, the Chinese Taiwan Manufacturing Corporation, over here. They're saying, well, if we give you our chips and China makes their own chips, then where's our national security? We want to be, we need you both dependent upon us. Otherwise, we've got no national security. Biden said, well, we'll put 50 billion and we'll persuade you. And then Trump said, okay, we're going to revive these zombie companies and do what China does. So we're going to become a shareholder in Intel. We're going to take some of that Biden money and $9 billion and try and revive Intel. But where's the cheap labor for this stuff? Where's the specialism? All right, we need AI and robotics. So everything in America now, the rebuilding of the manufacturing base, because America knows they lost the trade war. They did not wage a trade war. Tariffs was a recognition that China had already won the trade war. And the tariff policy was to draw everyone closer to BRICS and shrink America into a regional power. Who does Trump work for? The financial industrial complex. Who's the key player? Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs is investing in BRICS. BlackRock is taking all of this money that's outflowing from American dollar denominated, which is weakening the dollar. The DXY has gone from 102 down to about $97. And it's capital outflow. It's being reinvested in these different industries. So Trump works for BRICS, and he paints a MAGA narrative saying that we're going to rebuild the manufacturing base and we're going to create the Department of War. And essentially what tariffs did, it did three things. It took the American small business and medium-sized business and make it where they had to pay the tariff. The importer pays the tariff. What is America? America's the world reserve currency. The rule of world reserve currency, as per Triffin's dilemma, an economic concept, means that you have to have a twin deficit. It means you have to export dollars. You have to spend more than you bring in tax in order to push out that debt. And you need to import more than you export. And so you have these twin deficits, which is, that's how you create the dollar. And so if you try and reduce the debt or you try and reduce the trade balance, you crash the economy because you're no longer world reserve currency. So Elon Musk gave up on that and then just took all the data and integrated it into his artificial intelligence. And then the impact was that the importing country pays the tax. So now we're going to get this cycle where the small to medium sized business, they swallowed it initially. And what did BlackRock do? KKR has been record M&A activity. The large companies have been acquiring all the medium and small sized businesses in America, just like COVID. It was a massive consolidation of power. They do the same with Vietnam, all of the export-driven dependent countries. They acquire all of those, which have been impacted by it. The large multinational corporation, they just negotiate a deal because they got routes on both sides. They got a manufacturing base in China and they got a consumption base in America, and they can offset those deals and they can negotiate in order to have low impact. And then the medium-sized businesses, eventually, if they want to float, they have to put their price up. So you're doing fiscal dominance, printing money, you're doing tariffs, you're doing attack. And now the promise was, right, we're going to reduce the debt by tariff tax. How's that worked out? $350 billion in tax paid for by American companies. It was a tax on the American people. Then a tax on the American consumer because they're going to have to put their prices back. And Powell's reducing rates and Trump's trying to get him to reduce rates by 300 basis points, which has never been done in the whole Federal Reserve history. Also that they can roll over their debt. That's massively inflationary. And the other thing it did is it took every country and said, I'm going to now negotiate with BRICS and China. And so India went closer to BRICS. Russia, Iran, China created their way of circumventing sanctions. But, this all happened there. But the point of the tariff policy is that it was to reset the world order, and that's why they installed Trump.